The bar at Pelhen station had a name on the license, the counter. No one ever called it anything. The regulars called it the bar, or they called it Calder's, or they didn't call it anything because after enough time spent in a place you stop needing to name it. You just go. I had been going there for 9 years before I was the one behind it. That's not entirely accurate. I'd been behind it from the first week. What I mean is that for the first few months I kept expecting to stop, to hand the lease to someone else, to feel the pull of something that required me more. It never came. The license renewed. The shelves stayed full. The stools stayed worn in the same spots. After 2 years I stopped counting how long I'd been there, which meant I'd stopped planning to leave, which meant I'd arrived somewhere without noticing the arrival. I've done that before, in worse places and under worse conditions. But the bar was the first time it happened in a way that felt like a choice, rather than a field rotation ending. Pelhen Station is outer ring mid-tier, which means it is too far from the core for shipping lanes to run efficiently, but close enough to the transfer corridors that it doesn't die. It survives on layovers. A ship comes through, needs a 12-hour clearance window, and the crew wants somewhere that isn't the hull. The counter gave them that. 4 walls, real gravity, drinks that cost slightly more than they should and slightly less than they would anywhere in the core, and a human behind the bar who wasn't interested in their business. The last part mattered more than the price. Pelhen is a mixed station. 6% human at the last census, the rest spread across 11 registered species with a long tail of unregistered transients. I'd served Keth archivists and Shen traders, and once memorably, a Voruk freight contractor who took up 2 stools and needed a glass that held about 1.5 liters. I kept one on the top shelf after that visit, on the logic that if one Voruk found the place, a second one might. The glass is still up there. No one else ever asked for it. The point is, I didn't ask questions, I kept prices consistent, I poured what was ordered. That's the whole job. I was good at it by the end of the first year, and I'd stopped thinking about the fact that I was good at it by the end of the second. Some of the Pelhen regulars had asked in the early months whether I was military. The answer was past tense, which most of them understood without needing it explained further. Outering stations attract people who are finished with something and starting something else, or between the something and the something else, or still deciding. The bar is a good place for all 3 categories. You serve them all the same. You pour what is ordered. You don't ask about the something that was or the something that might be. The past tense is enough. I should explain how I got there. 31 years. That's the career. 12 deployed, the rest a mixture of training command, logistics oversight, and the kind of administrative work that the deathworlder designation makes necessary. If your personnel can outpace every threat assessment calibration the Interstellar Verification Bureau has fielded in the last 4 centuries, someone has to manage the paperwork that explains why their service record reads the way it does. I was good at that too. I was good at most things the military put in front of me, which was less a personal virtue than a function of where I came from. Keth-var breeds a certain kind of baseline. Class 11 designation, which the Bureau has been quietly updating to Class 11 primary for the last decade on the grounds that Class 11 undersells it, which is the kind of institutional understatement that keeps the paperwork manageable and the coalition meetings less alarming. I retired at 54, not because I had to, because the thing I was good at, the cold procedural daily maintenance of staying alive in conditions that ended most things, had become, over 31 years, something I could do without being aware I was doing it. And I found that I didn't want to do it unconsciously anymore. I wanted to do something I had to pay attention to. The bar required attention, not the same kind, but you'd be surprised how much the skill sets transfer. I had been a supply logistics officer before the deployment years, and a training command coordinator before that, and a junior field analyst in the 2 early years before I understood what I was actually suited for. What I was suited for was reading a room. Not in the dramatic sense, not in the sense of feeling tension, spotting weapons, triangulating threat. Those were skills I had, but they were skills. Reading a room, the real kind, is quieter than that. It's knowing when the three people in the corner are about to get loud before they know it. It's knowing that the pair by the door won't finish their drinks because something about the conversation they're having has already closed. It's knowing, without looking directly, when something has changed in a space, the way you know when a barometric pressure shifts, not from a single datum but from everything at once, which the competent person processes as a single feeling they can act on. I ran a 12-person logistics cell for 7 of the 12 deployed years. You learn to read a room when the room is your cell, and the cell's state of mind is a variable that affects whether a resupply chain holds. I later ran a 40-person training cohort, which is a different kind of room but the same basic problem. Knowing who is close to the edge, who is managing something they haven't said, who needs to be given something to do before they make a decision out of idleness that everyone will regret. By the time I retired, I had been reading rooms for 30 years, and I was very good at it. The bar is the purest form of the skill, stationary, regular inputs, high variety in the inputs but regulars anchor the variance. If you know your regulars, you can read any new arrival against them as a baseline. Orvath at the left end of the bar every morning was my longest baseline. I'd had him for 7 of my 9 years. He came in at the 4th hour of the first shift, drank 2 measures of the keth-still grain, and left before the 5th hour. He was never late, and on the 2 occasions he was absent, 1 medical, 1 personal, he had sent a message ahead. I knew his drink, his speed, his conversation load, his body posture when he was tired or troubled or satisfied or merely present. Pel was my anchor baseline. Everything else in the room I calibrated against him. This is not a skill unique to me. Any good bartender develops a version of it. But the version I had was built on a particular substrate, 31 years of stakes, 12 deployed, built on keth-var's original architecture, and that substrate meant the calibration ran faster and deeper than the version most bartenders develop. I noticed things I had no particular reason to notice. I retained things I had not consciously chosen to retain. I knew when a conversation 2 tables away had just shifted its valence, and what it had shifted toward, and whether it required anything from me. And all of this happened below the level of thought in the same way that breathing happens below the level of thought. Because the Deathworld builds that in, and the military builds on it, and 30 years of stakes embeds it so deeply that it is no longer skill so much as ground condition. You stand on it. I was standing on it the morning of the Commodore's visit. 3 regulars before the docking corridor lit up for the day shift traffic. Orvath at the left end of the bar, his drink ready. Sen Tichar, a human freight dispatcher 3 months off a Shen contract, who drank black tea and read shipping manifests on a chipped tablet and never looked up from it, and who I suspected would be reassigned in the next 2 months, because the frequency with which she checked the outbound manifests suggested she was looking for something specific rather than simply reviewing. And Dehev Chorus, a Shen cargo inspector who I suspected was sleeping in one of the farm maintenance corridors, but had never confirmed because it wasn't my business and he tipped reasonably. Dehev sat at the back table and nursed a single measure of Shenbark distillate for the better part of 2 hours on most mornings. He was very still when he drank it. Shen at rest are always somewhat still, but Dehev had a quality of stillness that I read as someone who had learned to be still on purpose rather than someone for whom stillness was a natural state. The distinction matters. Voluntary stillness in a Shen usually means something happened that made involuntary motion too expensive. I had opened the ventilation baffles on the far wall to let in the station's recycled morning air, which smelled like coolant and pressed metal, and nothing like morning but had that cadence to it, the shift change recycling cycle, and the distant mechanical thrum of the docking clamps cycling. The bar itself smelled like the bar. That is, keth-still grain, which has a grain and mineral note that the recycled air never fully covers, the Shenbark distillate, which is warmer, almost medicinal, the cleaning agent I used on the counter, which was neutral, and the baseline smell of a space where people have been coming for 9 years, which is a smell compounded of so many inputs that it stops being distinguishable and becomes simply the smell of the place. The regulars never noticed it. New arrivals sometimes did. That's how it goes. I was wiping the counter when the first light hit the upper dock window. Pelhen Station's upper ring has 3 oval windows that face the orbital plane, and for about 40 minutes at the start of each cycle, the station's arc carries them into angle with the local sun's glint off the transit beacon array. It's not sunrise. There's no sun visible from where I stood. But the light comes in at an angle that is analogous to the way morning light comes in through a room with east-facing windows, and it moves across the back shelf over the course of the 40 minutes in a way that is analogous to the way morning light moves. I'd noticed it in my first week. I'd thought, that will do. That was 9 years ago, and the light was still doing the same thing, and I was still watching it for the 40 minutes it lasted, which is not a habit I would have predicted for myself, and which I have never tried to explain. The Cephalori came in at the 4th hour of the first shift. I heard them before I saw them. Cephalori don't move quietly. Not as a failing. Their respiratory apparatus has a slight pressurized resonance to it, a soft rhythmic push-pull that in a quiet room carries about 4 meters. They also tend to walk with more vertical displacement than most species their mass would suggest, something to do with the way their locomotor structure manages the arm weight distribution of 6 limbs. You hear them and then you see them, and the sight after the sound usually confirms what the sound suggested, something large and complex, and used to moving through space as though the space would accommodate it. 4 of them. The Commodore I identified immediately, not from the rank insignia, which I knew, but which I processed after, but from the way the 3 behind him oriented. In any group of 4 Cephalori, one of them is the fixed point. The others triangulate off that axis without appearing to. It's subtle. 31 years of reading rooms teaches you to read it before you've consciously named what you're reading. Cephalori in the mottled gray coloration, which is the coloration the fleet service selects for not breeding. They don't work that way, but the fleet has run its personnel through enough high-density electromagnetic environments that the gray mottled pattern becomes dominant in long-service officers, something to do with photoreceptor adaptation over decades of direct relay exposure. The Commodore was very gray. His ventral patches were pale and slightly luminescent in the low bar lighting, which meant high cortisol regulation, which in Cephalori is a sign of either very deep calm or very practiced concealment of its opposite. I had seen both. I couldn't tell from a distance, and I didn't try. He had 5 of his 6 arms. That is, the 6th was present but shortened at the medial joint in a way that looked old and deliberately maintained rather than recently damaged. A working injury, healed around. He had kept the arm rather than opting for a prosthetic, which meant he had either decided the prosthetic would compromise his field sensitivity or had a relationship with the injury that made replacing it feel like a wrong action. Either way, he was the kind of officer who had made the decision deliberately, which told me something about how he managed the things that happened to him that couldn't be undone. I put the cloth down. Pel Orvath, at the left end of the bar, glanced up when the 4 came in and then glanced down again at his drink. He had learned over 7 years that whatever came through the door, I handled it, and his job was to stay on his stool and not complicate the handling. Sen Tichar didn't look up from her manifest. Dehev Chorus at the back table shifted very slightly in his chair. Dehev had a Shen's low-band threat assessment running at all times, something their species does involuntarily, and which operates on a register they can't fully articulate. 4 Cephalori fleet officers in off-schedule dress would have triggered at least a low-level registration. He didn't move from the table. He settled differently. If you knew Shen's stillness, you would have noticed the difference. I let the 4 come to the bar. The 2 junior officers took positions at the nearest stools without sitting on them, that Cephalori habit of hovering at the edge of a seat before committing to it, the locomotor structure making the sit or stand decision, take longer than it does for bipedal species. It looks like hesitation. It isn't. It's the body managing the weight distribution and calculating the fastest return to full extension if required. The civilian aide, a keth by the coloring, pale compound eyes, four-armed, very small in the transit coat, took a stool 3 down from the juniors and pulled out a data slate and stopped existing for the purposes of the conversation. The keth have a quality of deliberate social absence that I've always found useful. They know when they are not the relevant party and they act accordingly. The Commodore settled at the bar directly across from me. He didn't sit. Cephalori officers of flag rank almost never sit in informal settings. They manage the height differential differently, a controlled downward adjustment of the anterior arms, which brings the head mass into conversational range without committing the body to a seated position. It's very practiced, and it looks natural when you've seen it enough, and it means they can move at full extension inside 2 seconds if required. I noticed this the way I know as anything, not by flagging it consciously but by having it present at the edge of awareness, where it was useful without being intrusive. "What do you serve?" he said. Not a question the way most patrons asked it, which was either uncertain or perfunctory. He asked it the way you ask a question when you intend the answer to tell you something the question's surface doesn't suggest. An assessment question. He had come in doing an assessment. "What do you drink?" I said. A pause, about 1 second, which is a long time in that kind of exchange. "Ethanol-based," he said. "Mid-range concentration, nothing flavored." I poured him a measure of the keth-var still grain. It's a pale spirit, very clean, ethanol-forward with almost no aromatic profile. The keth call it a working drink, which means it does the job without asking you to appreciate it. I'd stocked it because keth archivists liked it. I'd found that Cephalori officers, when they came in, ordered whatever I put in front of them if I put it in front of them first. It's a dominance assessment behavior in Cephalori social context. The willingness to accept what is offered without reviewing the offering first signals something about how the officer reads the context. The context here was a civilian establishment where the Commodore was off the record, and accepting what I offered without negotiating it said, correctly, that he had walked into my environment and was choosing to operate on its terms. That choice was an assessment too. I poured the junior officers the same, without asking, since they would follow the Commodore's lead. He drank about 1/3 of his measure. He set it down. "You run this yourself," he said. "9 years," I said. He looked at his glass, then he looked at my hands on the counter. I want to be precise about this because the precision is the point. I was not doing anything with my hands. I had poured his drink and set the bottle down and put both hands flat on the counter, because that is what I do when I am not immediately occupied. The bar has a slight curve to the counter's far edge, and the flattest surface is the center section, and it had long since become habit. The hands were there, palm down, relaxed, not positioned for anything, not doing anything, just present. He looked at them for about 3 seconds. 3 seconds is a long look at a stranger's hands. I have seen that look before, not often, twice in 31 years of service. Both times from senior alien officers who had been in enough actual engagements to have calibrated their assessment of what a human at rest looks like versus what a human at rest who came from a Class 11 primary designation looks like. It is a different look than species recognition or standard civilian threat assessment. It is slower, and it moves from the hands to the forearms to the posture to the hands again, and it is very quiet, and it has a specific quality that I can only describe as professional in the original sense. The look of someone doing their job at a high level of competence and finding the job more interesting than they expected. He was recalibrating. What the hands show, if you know what to look for, is this: keth-var, Class 11 primary, 31 years of service, 12 of them deployed, the rest in environments where the baseline physical maintenance never fully switches off, because once the Deathworld has built you, it doesn't unbuild you when you leave it. The grip distribution when you pour a bottle. the way the tendons run at the wrist when the hand is flat. The callus patterns, which tell a specific story about what the hand has held, and at what frequency, and under what kind of load. The keth-var baseline runs the connective tissue in a particular way, denser than most human populations. The fascia laid down in a specific orientation that reflects what the class 11 environment asks of the body during the growth period, because the class 11 environment asks of it that it not fail under load. And then the military builds on that. And then 12 years of deployment builds on that. And at the end of 31 years, you have something that looks like a 54-year-old man who runs a bar, but the hands don't fully agree with that description. The hands are more honest than the rest of the presentation. They always are. I had spent 9 years cultivating an ordinary presentation, good enough that most people who came through the bar, including most of the humans, never had cause to read anything into the man behind the counter beyond the category of man behind the counter. It's not concealment. It's that the bar presents what it presents, and I present what is appropriate to the bar. And most people in a transit station are looking for a drink and not running a military-grade threat assessment on the personnel. The Commodore was running a military-grade threat assessment on the personnel. I looked back at him and waited. The two junior officers hadn't noticed. They were talking to each other in low Cephalori subsonic, a resonant exchange that humans can feel more than hear, a chest pressure oscillation that you register as something between a very low sound and a vibration. Their attention was turned inward, toward each other. The Keth aide had not looked up from the data slate. Pel Orvath was nursing his drink. Dehev chorus at the back table had gone into the specific stillness that, in a Shen, means not active assessment but a secondary register. Recognition that someone else in the room is doing the reading, and that the appropriate response is to wait and not complicate the space. Good instincts, Dehev. Consistent instincts. I had known this about him for a long time. 9 years, the Commodore said again, quietly, not to me as a statement of confirmation, to himself or to the glass or to whatever he was recalibrating against. Before that, 31, I said. I didn't offer it as an explanation. I placed it the way you place a piece of information that might be useful and might be irrelevant without direction, available if needed. He looked at me directly. The Cephalori direct gaze is frontal and wide. The eye arrangement gives them a broader primary field than human binocular vision, and it is recognizable as a directed attention in a way that is different from their ambient scanning. He was looking at me now. Keth-var, he said. Born there, I said. His ventral patches had changed. Not dramatically. The bioluminescence doesn't make a face in the way that facial musculature makes a face. It's not that articulated. But the distribution had shifted from the even high cortisol illumination I'd noted when he entered to something less uniform. The left anterior patch dimmer, the right brighter, which in Cephalori flag grade response patterns indicates an asymmetric cognitive load. The lateral processing centers are working something that the central register hasn't resolved yet. He was updating a significant datum, and the update was taking him somewhere. What rank, he said. Did you want another drink, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable with the redirect, he recognized it. Warrant officer, he said. Still not a confirmation-seeking question. A hypothesis presented as a question in the Cephalori pragmatic register. I'll take that as no to the drink, I said, and moved the bottle 2 inches toward him so he could reach it himself if he changed his mind. You're being polite, he said, or cautious. I'm being a bartender, I said, which is what I am. His 6 arms, 5 functioning, 1 foreshortened, did a very slight adjustment. Not threat posturing. The opposite. A redistribution of the arm mass that indicated the anterior pair were no longer subtly keyed for rapid extension, which is where Cephalori officers of his rank tend to keep them when they're uncertain about an environment and have not yet resolved their assessment of it. The posture releases when the assessment resolves. It resolved. His body agreed with the resolution. I had read that sequence, the subtle forward keying and then the release, in enough encounters over the years to have a reasonable model of what it meant in each case. In those cases, it had meant different things. Here it meant he had come in uncertain, had run his assessment, had found what the assessment found, and had concluded that the appropriate response was to stand down from the posture he'd been maintaining and finish his drink. Senior rank, he said, a statement now, not a hypothesis. Past tense, I said. He nodded. The cephalori nod is a slight anterior lean of the head mass and upper body rather than the vertical head bob. The architecture doesn't isolate the head movement the same way, but the communicative signal is the same, and I'd learned to read it the same way. He understood past tense. He had, I thought, a considerable amount of data on what past tense meant when attached to the kind of baseline the hands had described. He picked up his glass and finished the second third of it in a deliberate single motion, set it down, did not reach for the bottle. I apologize, he said, for the imposition. No imposition, I said. You walked in, you ordered, that's the transaction. I mean he stopped. The pause was not for emphasis. He was finding a precise word in a language that was not his primary one, and he was being careful with it. For the assessment, it was involuntary. I know, I said, it's fine. You knew I was doing it. I've had the look before, I said. From people who knew what to look for, not often. It's not a common skill, but it's not a first time. He was quiet for a moment that extended beyond the expected conversational beat. He was thinking about something and choosing whether to say it. Cephalori flag officers make those choices in a way you can see if you're watching for it. The ventral patches go through a very slight settling. The anterior arms come fractionally closer to the body, and the expression, which in cephalori terms is carried entirely in the patch illumination, and the angle of the facial cartilage becomes very slightly more static than their animated state. Decision being made, cost being weighed. He said it. You chose this, not an accusation, a genuine difficulty of understanding. I chose the bar, yes. I mean another pause. You came to a place like this after the 31 years, I said. Yes. I thought about how to answer him. I'd had the question before in various forms from various people, some of whom had the context to understand the answer, and some of whom did not. The Commodore had the context. That meant I could give him the actual answer rather than the short version. I needed to pay attention to something that required it but didn't cost what the other thing cost, I said. After 31 years, the other thing was running on a register I didn't have to think about, and I found that I didn't want to be somewhere where the most important thing I was doing was happening below thought. I wanted to have to be present for it. The bar does that. It requires presence, not the same intensity, but the same quality of attention, turned down to a level where I can sustain it without losing anything else. He was quiet. He took this seriously. I could see that in the patch illumination, which had gone from the processing asymmetry into a more even, slower frequency. He was considering it rather than working around it. And does it, he said, the bar, does it actually require that? Or does it become automatic in the way the other thing did? It was a good question. It was the question someone asks when they are thinking about a problem that is also, in some form, their own problem. There's a version of it that becomes automatic, I said. The mechanics, the pores, the prices, the hours, that automates, but the reading of the room doesn't, because the room changes. Different people every day, different configurations, different pressures. The regulars give you a baseline, but they shift too. Pell over there has been coming in for 7 years, and I learned something new about him roughly once a month. It's a slower kind of attention than the other thing, but it's attention. It doesn't go below thought. He looked at Pell. Pell, to his credit, continued staring at his drink as though the Commodore were not looking at him. Pell is very good at that. 12 years, the Commodore said. This was not directed at me specifically. Not an answer to anything I'd said. He was saying something out loud that he perhaps needed to say out loud, and I happened to be the person on the other side of the counter, in the same way that bartenders have always been the people on the other side of counters when something needs to be said out loud to someone who will hear it without it leaving the room. Before mandatory review, I said, not pushing, just confirming that I'd understood what he meant. Yes. 12 years is enough time, I said, for most things, depending on what you do with it. I'm not thinking of anything specific, he said. I know, I said, you don't have to be. He was quiet. The bar worked around us, the ventilation cycle, the low subsonic conversation of his junior officers, the scratch of Sen Tichar's stylus on her manifest, the very distant clamp thrum of a ship clearing the docking ring. I always heard that last sound as a small release, like a weight coming off a spring, a ship going home or going somewhere, the station holding what remained. Do you miss it? He said. I'd been asked this before. By Pel Orvath in my second year, when he was still calibrating what I was, and the question came out of a conversation about something else entirely. By a human trauma medic on a hospital transport layover who had recognized the unit patch on the back wall and asked with the directness of someone who needed to understand the answer for professional reasons. By the Voruk freight contractor, who had asked it without preamble and been prepared for either answer with the even interest of a species that doesn't complicate its questions. To each of them I had given some version of the same answer, the work sometimes, not what the work cost. To the Commodore I said, no. He looked at me. I miss the clarity, I said. There's a kind of clarity you get when the reading of the room is the difference between the room continuing and the room not continuing. You can't replicate it elsewhere. You can find things that approximate the edges of it, but the thing itself, no. I don't miss it. What I miss is something that came alongside it, which was the certainty that the attention I was paying was the right size for the thing I was paying attention to. The match between the scale of the reading and the scale of what the reading meant. I've found that in other places in smaller forms. The bar is one of them. It's enough. He sat with this. The anterior arms had settled all the way he was, as much as a Cephalori fleet Commodore in an off-ring transit bar could be, at ease. Not comfortable in the way that familiarity produces comfort. At ease in the way that understanding produces it. The understanding that the thing in front of him was what it appeared to be, and that what it appeared to be was not a threat and not a problem and not an anomaly to be resolved. Just a thing that was what it was. The bar provides the clarity, he said. A version of it, I said, a version that costs the right amount. And when the cost exceeds the version, he was still not asking for advice. He was building a model out loud and he was asking the model to answer. Then you find a different version, I said, or you go back. People do both. Have you considered going back? Once, I said, in the third year. A request came in through the Veterans Administrative Network, not an order, a request, which is different. A recruitment request for a training coordination role, nothing deployed, 2-year contract. I read the request, thought about it for 2 days and declined. Why? I looked at the shelves behind me, the keth still grain, the Shenbark distillate, the Voruk glass on the top shelf that nobody ever asked for. The framed unit patch and the 2 citations on the back wall that I kept because they were mine and it would feel strange to put them somewhere I couldn't see them, though I no longer thought about what they represented on a daily basis. They were just there, part of the room. Because, I said, I had already arrived somewhere, and I'd taken me a long time to get here, and I didn't want to take the risk that I couldn't find my way back. The Commodore looked at the shelves. He looked at the unit patch. I watched him read it. The Cephalori have good long-range visual acuity. Flag officers of 30 years even more so. And I watched his ventral patches do the settling thing that meant he was processing something that had just resolved. 11th Combined Logistics, he said. 11th Combined Logistics Command, I said. Training and Operational Support Detachment, 3rd through 7th years. then field deployment. "I know the 11th, he said. He said it the way you say something that you know precisely and have been knowing for a long time and are now, for the first time, placing in a context that makes a different kind of sense. Not surprised. Thoughtful." "I assumed," I said. A silence, long enough to be deliberate. He was making something of it. "Corin 4, he said, not a question. "I was there," I said. He drank the last of his measure, poured the last third himself, reaching for the bottle, finding it, pouring with the deliberate economy of someone who has made a decision and is executing it. Set the glass down with the particular finality of a man who has completed what he came to do. "Thank you for the drink," he said. "Safe transit," I said. It is, in my experience, a harder thing than most people make it look, to receive something clearly, to not complicate it, to not add anything to the transaction that the transaction doesn't require. The Commodore did it cleanly. He had come in with a purpose and he had completed the purpose and he was going, and nothing about the going was owed an explanation or a performance. He was good at clean transactions. That is not a common skill. He turned to his junior officers and said something in the low Cephalori subsonic that I felt more than heard. The junior officers stood. The Keth aide put away the data slate and stood. The Commodore did not look back at me. He led them out the way he had come in, the same vertical displacement quality to his movement, the same fixed point property that made the three behind him orient around his axis. And then they were through the door, and the door cycled shut, and the bar sounds came back up to their normal register in the way sounds always do when something large has vacated a space. Pelhen looked up from his drink. I picked up the cloth and went back to wiping the counter. "What was that?" Pel said, not alarmed. Curious, in the way Pel was curious about things that fell outside his established pattern model of the bar. "Fleet officers on a layover," I said. "They barely touched their drinks." "The Commodore finished his," I said. "The juniors ordered, that's enough." Pel watched me wipe the counter. He has good instincts, Pelhen. He has been on this station long enough to read its rhythms, which means he has been around me long enough to have read some of mine, though I have never offered him a direct line on any of it. He looked at the door, then at the 3 glasses, the Commodore's empty, the 2 junior officers less than half finished, then at me. "You know him," Pel said. "No," I said, "never met him before this morning." "But he knew you." I thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was, he knew what I am, which is a different thing from knowing me. Knowing me takes 7 years of morning drinks and consistent prices and a stool on the left end of the bar and having your glass ready before you sit down. Knowing what I am takes 31 years of service, and enough of those years deployed in enough engagements to have calibrated your threat assessment at a level of precision most officers don't develop. Because the precision requires the kind of experience most officers are fortunate enough to never accumulate. The Commodore had that precision. He had used it. He had found what it found, and he had responded to what he found with the considered decision of a flag-grade officer, who has been in enough rooms to know that the unusual quiet is the best available outcome, and that the correct response to the best available outcome is to complete your transaction and leave. "He read the room," I said. "He's good at it. He left when he had what he came for." Pel looked at me for a moment. "What did he come for?" I finished wiping the counter, put the cloth down. "I don't know," I said, which was mostly true. The best I had was a hypothesis, which was that the Commodore had needed to confirm something. What a particular combination of elements looks like when it has made a particular choice, whether the choice holds, whether the choice is what the face of it says it is. He had confirmed it, and having confirmed it, he had stayed for the last third of his drink, not because he needed it, but because the confirmation had produced in him something that required a small amount of time to accommodate, and the drink gave the time a shape. Whether that was restful or instructive or simply something he would carry with him, I didn't know and didn't ask. He had paid for his measure and his junior officer's measures, and he had tipped well and said thank you and left. That's the whole transaction. Everything else belongs to him. Pell nodded. He looked at his drink. He drank it. He is a keth, and keth have a reasonable instinct for the limits of what they need to know, which is one of the reasons I've always found him easy to work with. Good drink today, he said. Same as every day, I said. I know, he said, that's what I mean. Dehev chorus came to the bar about 20 minutes later. I poured him a second measure of the shenbark distillate without being asked, because he had stood up from his back table, and I'd seen the stand from the corner of my eye and had it ready when he arrived. He stood at the bar with the deliberate quality of stillness that in a shen indicates something being considered at the level below language. That officer, he said. What about him, I said. He is a Commodore of the Vethek Fleet Command, Dehev said. The commission's signature on the clearance board. He is one of the signatories to the Pelhen Trade Corridor Treaty. There is a ceremony in the treaty conference room in 6 hours. I know, I said. The clearance board that morning had had a Vethek commission header on it. I had noted it the way I noted all commission headers, as a data point that told me something about what the day's traffic would look like, and whether I needed to do anything specific to prepare for it. He came here first, Dehev said. Before the ceremony, before the official reception, he came to the outer ring bar. Transit stations have good hours, I said. Conference spaces don't open until the 3rd shift. Dehev was quiet. He processes the social geometry of spaces thoroughly and carefully, and he had been in the bar long enough to know that I process things similarly, which means our conversations have long gaps in them that neither of us has ever found uncomfortable. The gap ran. He was assessing you, Dehev said finally. He was assessing the bar, I said. He was assessing you, Dehev said again, with the Shen conversational habit of not arguing the repetition, but simply restating the thing they believe to be accurate until the space around it resolves. His attention was on you, not on the bar. Maybe, I said. What did he determine? I considered the shift in the ventral patches, the release of the anterior arm posture from the forward keyed position he'd been holding when he came in, the way he'd poured the last third himself, a gesture of a specific kind, not quite at ease, but past the point of formal guard, the posture of a man who has confirmed something and found the confirmation satisfactory in a way he had not entirely expected and was now sitting with. The way he'd said thank you, which was not what you say to a bartender in the transactional sense. It was what you say when you have received something that had value. He determined that the bar is what it looks like, I said. Dehev considered this, and what does it look like? A bar, I said, on an outer ring station, run by one person 9 years, nothing unusual. Dehev looked at me with the Shen expression that indicates they are deciding how much further to press a point. He decided, not far. He picked up his drink, assessed it, held it for a moment. He left satisfied, Dehev said. He finished his drink, I said. That's enough. Dehev went back to his table. The bar continued. The rest of the morning shift ran normally. 4 more layover crews came through. A keth shipping crew of 7 who needed a long table and straightforward drinks and nothing complicated. A Shen navigator and her mate who spoke to each other exclusively in the short resonant Shen exchange, and drank the bark distillate without conversation. 2 human freight techs from a core route carrier who ordered the loudest drinks on the menu and talked continuously and tipped well, and a single Cephalori who was not fleet service and had the pail. Erratic arm movement of someone who was tired enough that the body's management systems were running on a reduced budget. I gave him the working spirit and didn't make conversation, because what he needed wasn't conversation. I watched the morning light make its 40 minutes across the back shelf and move on. At the midpoint of the shift, when the first wave of crews had cleared and the second hadn't come in yet, I had the bar to myself for about 12 minutes. Pell had gone to his logistics office. Sen Tichar had left when her shift started. Dehev was still at his back table but had gone into the light Shen dormancy that passes for sleep in their physiology, body at rest, lower registers still active, entirely undisturbing. I wiped the counter. It was already clean. That's what wiping the counter is, most of the time not cleaning, but the maintenance of the motion of the thing. The counter gets wiped when the bar is quiet, and the bar being quiet is fine, and the act of wiping the counter is the way the bar says so without saying anything. I thought about Corin 4. I don't think about it often. I used to think about it differently with more weight to it, a certain density that made it hard to get past in the sequence of recalled things. That density fades over time if you let it. Not the memory itself, just the weight. What you're left with is a very accurate account of what happened, which no longer costs you anything to access, which is a reasonable outcome and probably the best one available. Corin 4 was the third of the 12 deployed years, and the one that produced the most paperwork. Not for the reasons that produced the most paperwork in training command years, not because personnel were managed poorly or supply chains failed. Because the kind of thing that happened at Corin 4 produces a specific category of administrative consequence when the personnel in the engagement file with the deathworlder designation, and the outcome of the engagement is the outcome of that engagement. The paperwork is not punitive. It is genuinely uncertain. The system is genuinely uncertain still about how to file certain categories of outcome when the outcome is produced by a particular quality of trained response under a particular quality of lethal pressure, and that uncertainty produces documentation. What I mean is, the thing that the Deathworld builds when the military has had 30 years to train it and 12 to deploy it, does not produce outcomes that fall neatly into the standard assessment categories. There is a register below anger, below panic, below any of the arousal states that most species experience under terminal conditions, where the response is simply very fast and very cold and very thorough, and Corin 4 had produced several hours of that register, and the documentation that followed was substantial. The Verification Bureau had reviewed it 3 times. Their review conclusions had been consistent, which was classified not because of error or misconduct, but because the classification is the only container the system has for something it cannot fully model. I had managed the documentation for the 11th share of that engagement, then for my own record, then for the Bureau's 3rd review. I had been very precise about it. Precision in documentation is the only thing you can give to something that happened and cannot be unmade. You can at least ensure that the record of it is accurate, even if the record lives in a file that very few people can access. The Commodore knew the 11th, which meant he had at some point encountered the 11th's documentation, the public record version, which was summary enough to be manageable, or the access version, which required clearance and produced, in officers with enough experience to read what it described, a specific quality of recognition. Not alarm, recognition. The difference between those two is the distance between someone who has read about a thing and someone who has been in enough rooms to know what the thing means. He had stayed for the last third of his drink anyway. I thought about what that was worth. I decided, a reasonable amount, not less than that and not more. It was the gesture of a man who had confirmed something he suspected, and found that the confirmation was not alarming and had chosen to sit with that finding for the brief time his schedule allowed. That is a considered response. It is the response of someone who has been in enough rooms to know that the thing you confirm and don't act on is sometimes the most useful thing in the room. I had been in enough rooms to know that too. Here we were, 2 people on opposite sides of a counter who had read the same room and arrived at the same conclusion without requiring the other to explain it. That is the ideal outcome for most rooms. 6 weeks later, a package came through the station's certified courier system addressed to the counter, Pelhen Station, with a Vethek Fleet Command clearance code in the sender field and no return name. Small box, sealed with a commercial-grade integrity seal, labeled in the standard transit format. Inside, a bottle, dark glass, plain label in Cephalori script. I have enough Cephalori to read a label. It took me a moment to parse the two primary words, because Cephalori script uses a positional grammar that requires you to read the word pair as a unit rather than sequentially. When I had it, what I had was the name of the spirit, which was a working-class Cephalori grain distillate, and the distillery, which was in one of the lower Vethek orbital stations, and the grade, which was the functional grade, the grade that indicates the spirit does what it needs to do without requiring you to appreciate the doing. No note, the bottle was the note. The bottle was the entire communication. It said, I found a version of the same shelf. This is what's on mine. I put it on the top shelf next to the Vorak glass, that no one had ever come back for a second time. The shelf is where I keep the things that mark something without needing to explain the marking. The Vorak glass, the unit patch, and the two citations on the back wall, which are visible from behind the counter but not, I think, legible to most of the people who come in. And now the bottle of Cephalori working spirit, dark glass, plain label, from a station I had never been to and would likely never go to, sent by a flag officer I had spoken to for about 20 minutes and would probably never speak to again. The shelf doesn't need to be explained. It just needs to exist. Pell came in the next morning, sat on his stool. His drink was ready before he sat down, same as every morning for 7 years because that's how it goes. He looked up at the shelf. New bottle, he said. Arrived yesterday, I said. What is it? Cephalori working spirit, I said. A fleet grade one, from one of the orbital stations. Pell looked at it for a moment with the expression he gets when he is deciding whether to ask the second question. He has learned, over 7 years, that I'll answer the second question if it's worth answering and redirect if it isn't, and he's developed a reasonable model of which is which. He decided, not this one. For sale, he said. Not yet, I said. Probably not ever, we'll see. Pell nodded. He went back to his drink. The station cycled into its next shift. The light came in at its angle through the oval windows and made its 40 minutes across the back shelf, across the keth still grain and the shenbark distillate and the Vorak glass and the Cephalori bottle, moving evenly from left to right the way it always did, reaching the bottle last and holding on it for a moment, or seeming to, before the arc of the station carried it past. I wiped the counter. The bar opened at the first light, same as always. It always does. That is the rule of the thing, and the rule holds, and the counter gets wiped, and the room continues. That is the whole of it. A flag officer came in one morning, read the room, read the hands, and left with what he came for. 6 weeks later something arrived in the mail that said, I understand the choice. That is the whole of it. It's enough. The counter is clean. There is a thing that happens when you run a bar long enough that no one who has not run one can fully explain to someone who hasn't. The bar becomes a kind of continuous argument for the proposition that ordinary life is worth sustaining, not because the bar is extraordinary, because it isn't. Because it is demonstrably, visibly, day after day, not extraordinary, and yet here it is, and here the people are, and here the drinks are, and here the morning light is making its transit across the shelf, and here the counter is being wiped, and none of it requires justification. It simply continues. I needed that argument when I came here. I did not know I needed it. I thought I needed quiet and a reduced operational tempo and enough time to sleep without the rotation schedule determining when. Those things were true, but the deeper thing was the argument, the demonstration, repeated daily, that the ordinary is not a consolation prize, that arriving somewhere stable and good and unremarkable and staying there is not a failure of ambition, that the counter, wiped clean every morning, is not nothing. 9 years is a long time to make an argument. By now I believe it without having to think about it, which means the argument is settled, and the bar is just the bar and I am just the man behind it, and that is entirely sufficient. The Commodore would work this out in 12 years or before. He had the intelligence for it. He had, I thought, already started working it out, which was why he had come to the outer ring bar before the treaty ceremony rather than after. He was looking for evidence that the working out was possible. He had found it and left, and 6 weeks later the bottle said, "Received." That is enough. Most transmissions are simpler than they look when you decode them. Most of the complicated ones become simple when you've had long enough to look. I put the cloth down. I looked at the shelf, the Vorak glass, the Cephalori bottle, the unit patch, the 2 citations, and then I looked at the bar, which was what it was. 4 walls, real gravity, consistent prices, the light on its reliable schedule through 3 oval windows, Pel Orvath on his stool in 9 minutes, Sen Tichar in 12, Dehev Chorus whenever he appeared from wherever Dehev Chorus slept. And then the layover crews, different every day, the same kinds of different, requiring the same kinds of attention and receiving it. The docking clamps thudded once deep in the station's frame, a ship clearing, somewhere going. I picked up the cloth and started on the far end of the counter where the grain had dried in a faint ring where Pel's glass always sat. I worked toward the middle. The ring came off. The counter was clean. The bar opened at the first light. It always does.